World knew Jimi Hendrix, Leon knew Buster. Starved together Seattle, separated forever. Leon heard Jimmy dead, prison radio. Seattle, Washington, 1950s. A small house that barely qualified as shelter, where two brothers tried to survive circumstances that no children should have to endure. The world would come to know one of them as Jimi Hendrix, the greatest guitarist who ever lived. But his younger brother Leon knew him by a different name, a name that spoke to their shared childhood, their shared dreams, their shared hunger. Leon knew him as Buster. The name came from Buster Crabbe, the actor who played Flash Gordon in the science fiction serials the brothers loved. In those grainy black and white images of rocket ships and distant planets, Jimmy and Leon found escape from a reality that was often unbearable. They would sit together, two small boys in threadbare clothes, watching heroes traverse the cosmos, imagining themselves anywhere but where they were. "Call me Buster," Jimmy insisted to his family. Not James, not Johnny, not any of the names adults had given him. Buster, the name of an adventurer, an explorer, someone who could escape gravity and find freedom among the stars. But on Earth, in Seattle, there was no escape, only survival. Their father, Al Hendrix, struggled with alcoholism and an inability to provide stability. Their mother, Lucille, battled her own demons with alcohol. The violence between their parents was frequent and terrifying. When they fought, and they fought often when drunk, Jimmy would grab Leon's hand and pull him into a closet, holding his little brother until the screaming stopped. "It's okay," Buster would whisper to Leon in the darkness. "We're in the spaceship. We're going somewhere else." But they never went anywhere else. They stayed in Seattle, in cheap hotels and temporary apartments, in a life defined by absence and want. The absence of food was constant. Jimmy and Leon didn't just experience hunger. They lived in a state of chronic starvation that shaped their bodies, their behavior, their understanding of the world. Meals were irregular and insufficient. Days would pass where they ate almost nothing. Their clothes hung loose on their thin frames. Their shoes had holes in them, not stylish distressing, but actual holes worn through from walking on insufficient soles until the street showed through.
Other children at school noticed. Teachers noticed. The social workers noticed. But noticing didn't mean fixing. The Hendrix boys were known as the hungry kids, the poor kids, the ones whose father couldn't quite keep it together and whose mother had disappeared into her own struggles. So they did what starving children do. They stole. Jimmy, the older brother and protector, would take Leon to grocery stores. They had a system born of necessity and desperation. Jimmy would distract the clerks while Leon grabbed what he could: bread, canned goods, anything that would keep them alive another day. Sometimes they'd steal fruit, stuffing apples or oranges into their pockets. Sometimes it was packages of crackers, whatever was portable, whatever wouldn't be immediately noticed, whatever would sustain them. Then they'd run, two boys with holes in their shoes and hunger in their bellies, racing through Seattle streets with stolen food that might sustain them until the next theft. They'd find a place to eat, an alley, a park, anywhere they wouldn't be seen, and divide whatever they'd taken. Jimmy always made sure Leon ate first. Leon, in his later memoir, remembered the constant focus on food, what they ate, when they ate, where the next meal would come from. The poverty wasn't just material, it was emotional and spiritual. But through it all, Jimmy protected his little brother. When there was only one piece of food, Jimmy gave it to Leon. When their father's anger needed a target, Jimmy put himself between Al and Leon. When the cold Seattle nights made their inadequate shelter feel like a prison, Jimmy would tell Leon stories about Buster Crabbe and Flash Gordon, about rocket ships and adventure, about a future where they wouldn't be hungry anymore.
"We're gonna make it, little brother," Buster would say. "One day we're not gonna be hungry. One day we're gonna have everything we need." The family moved constantly, staying in whatever cheap accommodation Al could afford. The instability was crushing. Leon couldn't count on anything, not a home, not a meal, not even the presence of both parents. But he could count on Buster. His big brother was the one constant in a world of variables. Then came the separations that defined their tragedy. In 1951, when Jimmy was 9 and Leon was 3, their parents divorced. The court granted Al custody of Jimmy and Leon, but not of their younger siblings. Joseph, born in 1949, Kathy in 1950, and Pamela in 1951, 3 more Hendrix children who'd barely had a chance to know their brothers, were given up to foster care and adoption. The family that was barely holding together fractured completely, scattering children across Seattle's social services system like seeds that would never grow together. Jimmy and Leon remained with their father, but the threat of separation hung over them constantly. Leon was in and out of foster care throughout his childhood, living with the knowledge that at any moment he could be taken away from his brother again. The system deemed Al unable to care for all his children consistently, so Leon would be removed, placed with strangers, then returned when Al convinced authorities he could manage, then removed again when he couldn't.
Each separation was traumatic. Leon would watch Jimmy getting smaller through the rear window of a social worker's car, not knowing when or if he'd see his brother again. Each reunion was temporary, joyful, but shadowed by the knowledge that it wouldn't last. They learned not to count on permanence, not to believe in stability. The only thing they could believe in was the bond between them, and even that was constantly being tested by forces they couldn't control. The bond between the brothers was strong, but the system and circumstances were stronger. No matter how much Jimmy wanted to protect Leon, he couldn't protect him from being taken away by authorities with clipboards and legal power. As Jimmy got older, music became his escape and his salvation. He carried a broom to school, pretending it was a guitar, lost in imagination. A social worker recognized his obsession and tried to get him an actual instrument, writing letters requesting funding for this child who needs a guitar to avoid psychological damage. Her efforts failed. Al refused to buy Jimmy a guitar. But Jimmy found one anyway, a one-string ukulele in garbage he was hauling for a side job. He taught himself to play Elvis songs on that single string. Later, he'd get an acoustic guitar and practice for hours, developing calluses, building the foundation of genius. Music became Jimmy's way out, and as music consumed him more completely, the distance between him and Leon began to grow, not emotionally, but practically. They were still brothers. Jimmy still loved Leon, but Jimmy was moving towards something, and Leon couldn't follow. In 1961, when Jimmy was 18, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. It was partly to avoid legal trouble, partly to find structure, partly to escape Seattle. For Leon, it meant losing his protector, his big brother, his Buster. After his discharge in 1962, Jimmy began his journey through the music world, the Chitlin Circuit, backing bands, Nashville, New York. He would call Leon from the road sometimes, playing early versions of songs that would become legendary. Leon would hold the phone and hear his brother's guitar, hear the genius developing, hear Buster becoming Jimi Hendrix. But they were living in different worlds now. Jimmy was pursuing music with single-minded intensity. Leon, without his brother's protection and guidance, was pursuing survival through different means.
Leon fell into the hustler's life. Drugs and crime became his reality. While Jimmy channeled his energy into creating music, Leon channeled his into the street life that offered quick money and temporary relief from the poverty that had defined their childhood. The brothers took divergent paths from the same starting point. Both were products of starvation, neglect, trauma. Jimmy transformed that pain into art. Leon transformed it into self-destruction. By 1966, when Jimi went to London and became a phenomenon, Leon was already caught in the cycle of addiction and incarceration, minor offenses, drugs, the kind of crimes that poor people get locked up for while wealthy people get treatment. When the Jimi Hendrix Experience exploded onto the scene, Hey Joe, Purple Haze, Monterey, worldwide fame, Leon was in prison. Leon heard about his brother's success from behind bars. He heard the music on the radio. He saw articles in newspapers. The whole world was discovering Jimi Hendrix, and Leon was proud, but also painfully aware that the distance between them had become unbridgeable. At some point during Jimi's fame, when Leon was incarcerated, Jimi wanted to visit. He wanted to see his little brother. He wanted to arrange a concert at the prison, wanted to do something, anything, to maintain the connection that had sustained them both through their starving Seattle childhood. But Mike Jeffery, Jimi's manager, refused permission. "Absolutely not," Jeffery said. "The optics were wrong. The timing was wrong. It would be a distraction." Whatever his reasons, the result was the same. Jimi did not visit Leon in prison. And they never saw each other again. The last time Leon saw Jimi in person, before the fame, before London, before everything, that was the last time. No goodbye that acknowledged its finality. No last conversation where they remembered being Buster and little brother, stealing food to survive, hiding in closets from violence, dreaming of rocket ships. Just separation, then years, then nothing.
September 18th, 1970. Leon was in prison. Morning broke like any other morning behind bars. The same routine, the same walls, the same awareness that life was happening somewhere else to other people. Wake-up call, count, breakfast, the machinery of incarceration grinding through another day. The radio was on in the common area, news, music, the background noise of the outside world. Most inmates half-listened, the way you half-listen to anything that's always there. Traffic reports, weather, sports scores, the sound of freedom reduced to background static. Then the announcement came through the speakers. Rock guitarist Jimi Hendrix was found dead this morning in London. He was 27 years old. The cause of death appears to be asphyxiation. Leon heard it like every other prisoner heard it, as news about someone famous, someone they didn't know personally, someone whose death was tragic but distant. Inmates around him reacted with mild surprise, the way people react to celebrity deaths. Damn, Jimi Hendrix? Man, he was young. Wasn't he just at Woodstock? But for Leon, the words hit different. His brother, Buster. The voice saying rock guitarist Jimi Hendrix was talking about the boy who'd held him in closets, who'd stolen food with him, who'd promised they'd make it together. Except Leon did know him personally. Leon knew him as Buster. Leon knew him as the big brother who'd protected him from violence, shared stolen food, whispered reassurances in dark closets, promised a future where they wouldn't be hungry anymore. And now a radio voice was informing him, along with millions of strangers, that Buster was gone. The prison authorities didn't tell Leon immediately. They didn't need to. He'd heard it on the radio like everyone else. His brother was dead, and he learned about it the same way millions of strangers learned about it. There was no private notification, no phone call, no chaplain pulling him aside to deliver the news with compassion. Just a radio announcement in a prison common room. Jimi Hendrix's death delivered between a weather report and a commercial for car insurance. The grief was compounded by the setting. Leon couldn't leave, couldn't go to London, couldn't attend the funeral, couldn't see Jimi's body, couldn't say goodbye, couldn't do any of the things that help the living process death. He was locked in a cell while the world mourned a guitar god, knowing that the world was mourning someone they'd only known through music, while Leon was mourning Buster, the brother who'd held his hand in the darkness. He had to grieve in prison, surrounded by strangers, with no privacy, no space to process what had happened. Other inmates offered condolences, "Sorry about your brother, man." But they didn't understand. They thought they were offering sympathy about a famous musician. They didn't know they were offering sympathy about the loss of the person who'd defined Leon's childhood, who'd been his protector, his provider, his promise of a better future.
The irony was crushing. Jimi had become exactly what he'd promised Leon they'd become. Not hungry, not poor, not struggling. He'd transcended their childhood completely, becoming one of the most famous musicians in the world. But Leon was still in the system, still caught in the cycle of poverty and crime that Jimi had escaped through music. And now Jimi was dead, and the promised future where they'd both be okay was impossible. Buster wasn't coming back to rescue his little brother. The rocket ship had crashed. Years later, Leon would write about their childhood with a specificity that only someone who'd lived it could provide. The details of their hunger, what they ate, what they stole, how they survived. The cold Seattle nights, the violence at home, the constant moving, the fear that they'd be separated permanently. And woven through all of it, the love between brothers, Jimi's protection of Leon, the nickname Buster, the science fiction dreams that helped them escape, the bond that poverty and trauma couldn't break even when circumstance and fate drove them apart. Leon spent the rest of his life in Jimi's shadow, trying to make something of himself through music and art, fighting addiction, fighting the system, fighting the reality that his big brother had become immortal, while Leon remained very mortal and very much stuck in the consequences of their shared childhood. The world knew Jimi Hendrix, the psychedelic guitar god, the Monterey Fire, the Woodstock Anthem, the revolutionary musician who changed what was possible with an electric guitar. But Leon knew Buster, the brother who gave him the last piece of food, who pulled him into closets to protect him from violence, who whispered about rocket ships in the darkness, who promised they'd escape together. They did escape, but not together. Jimi escaped to worldwide fame and early death. Leon escaped only intermittently and incompletely, and never far enough to be free of the gravity that pulled him back to prison, to poverty, to the cycle that had defined their childhood. And in September 1970, while the world learned about the death of Jimi Hendrix through news reports and radio announcements, Leon learned about the death of Buster the same way, through a prison radio, alone in a cell, separated forever from the brother who'd promised they'd make it together. If this story of brothers separated by circumstance and tragedy moved you, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who understands that sometimes the people closest to legends never escape the same circumstances that drove the legends to greatness. Have you ever been separated from someone you loved by forces beyond your control? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video for more untold stories of the human cost behind musical genius.